At the 2012 annual meeting of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, Professor Susan L. Miller won the Outstanding Book Award for her work titled After the Crime: The Power of Restorative Justice Dialogues Between Victims and Violent Offenders. In this work, Miller examines dialogues that occurred between the victims of violent crimes and their offenders. The victims portrayed in the book experienced violent crimes ranging from stranger rape to attempted murder to child sexual abuse, among other crimes. In all of these cases, victims met with their offenders anywhere from 6 to 28 years after the crimes had taken place. By this time, the offender had already been tried and convicted and placed in prison. And in some cases, the offender had either served his sentence or was about to be released from prison. All of the victims and offenders described in this book took part in a program known as Victims' Voices Heard. Victims' Voices Heard is a restorative justice program that puts victims in touch with their offenders. The restorative justice model sees crimes as a violation of people and relationships. This violation creates obligations to make things right. The focus is on meeting victims' needs and providing offenders with an opportunity to repair the harm they have done. As you can probably imagine, victims of violent crimes often feel rage and anger, and sometimes this will strike out at the oddest moments, and it can even be misdirected at beloved family members or friends of the victims. Self-doubt, self-blame, self-hatred, and self-destructive acts are also prevalent in the aftermath of a violent victimization. Sometimes victims have questions that only the offender can answer. For example, many victims want to know why their offender decided to victimize them in particular. Also, it is not uncommon for victims to want their offenders to assure them face to face that they will not seek to harm them ever again. The criminal justice system, by and large, does not meet all of the psychological needs of the victim. This is why restorative justice programs such as Victims' Voices Heard have emerged. To research her book, Susan Miller interviewed victims and offenders who had participated in face-to-face meetings. In some cases, Miller also viewed a tape of these meetings. Miller points out in the opening of her book that none of the offenders received any type of incentive, such as parole or clemency appeal considerations for participating in these meetings. Is it possible for offenders to truly understand the harm that they have caused? And if so, can they play a role in helping their victims in the recovery process? These are all questions which are part of the restorative justice model, which was developed to better address victims' needs. Restorative justice programs such as Victims' Voices Heard encourage offender accountability. They assist victims in answering their questions, and they assist in the healing process, and they promote reconciliation between victims and offenders. The restorative justice movement goes far beyond the current war on crime strategies of containment and crime control. Restorative justice is intriguing on a number of levels for the potential benefits for the victims, the rehabilitative potential for the offenders, and the prospects for healing communities. As previously mentioned, the Victims' Voices Heard program described in this book operates at the end of the criminal justice process, which is often several years after the sentencing of the defendants. The victims interviewed for this book felt strongly that their offenders needed to be held accountable by the criminal justice system and did not wish to sidestep that aspect of justice and punishment. Rather, the victims wanted the opportunity to meet with their offenders after the conclusion of the criminal justice process in order to obtain more information about the crime as well as other aspects of the offender's current state of mind. Again, these are questions that only the offender has the ability to answer. In her book, Miller argues that post-conviction programs such as Victims' Voices Heard can even be effective in crimes of gendered violence, where men are generally the offenders while women and girls are overwhelmingly the victims. But make no mistake, Miller is not advocating that victim-offender mediation programs be used in lieu of the formal criminal justice system. As long as offenders are already adjudicated and under correctional control, programs like Victims' Voices Heard have the potential to help to heal the victim and perhaps even the offender. When you really think about it, there must be something truly liberating for a victim who is able to communicate to an offender the effects of the things he did to her. This has the potential to be remarkably empowering, especially if the dialogue occurs in a safe place, such as a correctional facility where a guard is often present at the dialogue. The victim, who is free on the outside, is more empowered than the offender who is locked up. The Victims' Voices Heard program focuses primarily on healing. But again, this program does not let offenders off the hook for the crimes they committed. According to Miller, only 25 states offer dialogue programs for victims of severe violence. But though perhaps this is increasing, and probably has since the publication of the book in 2011. Victims themselves must initiate the process rather than police or victim services workers. Offenders cannot establish the first contact. In fact, upon an offender's conviction, it is typical for a victim and the offender to abide by a statute to a no-contact order. Because the VVH program operates at the post-conviction stage, with most offenders behind bars or under the control of the probation or parole department, offenders are promised neither leniency nor a reduced sentence for agreeing to engage in dialogues with their victims. When offenders are approached a number of years following the criminal act that led to their incarceration, they may have the time needed to develop empathy. And again, according to Miller, they are not given any type of leniency for participating in the VVH program. Only offenders who accept full responsibility for the crime they committed are eligible to participate in the Victims' Voices Heard program. If it is evident that the victims are too angry to participate, or offenders are not willing to accept responsibility for their crime or express remorse, then it is typically not appropriate for the victim and offender to meet. When a meeting between a victim and an offender occurs, there is an enormous amount of preparation that goes into this. Generally, a facilitator will meet with both parties separately for at least 6 months on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. Of course, this may vary somewhat between state to state and program to program. Most programs also allow victims and offenders to have a support person to be present during the dialogue, though at least one victim-offender dialogue program in Texas does discourage this. Once a victim-offender dialogue meeting takes place, a facilitator will conduct private debriefings with both the victim and the offender. A face-to-face dialogue between the victim and the offender is only a one-time event. According to Miller, the Victims' Voices Heard program permits a one-time meeting between the victim and offender, recognizing that continued contact would not be beneficial to either the victim or the offender. The Department of Justice lifts the no-contact stipulation between the victim and the offender, and once the dialogue is completed, the no-contact order is reinstated by the judge. This offers the best protection against any unforeseen circumstances that could develop with continued contact between a victim and an offender. In her book, Miller provides details of several actual cases of victim-offender dialogues. First, she discusses a case where a 17-year-old African-American male, who she refers to as Jamil, raped a 49-year-old Caucasian woman, who is referred to as Donna. Miller writes that the victim's experiences with the police, the prosecutors, and the hospital were positive, and attributes the supportive nature of the criminal justice response to the fact that a young African-American male stranger had raped an older white woman who was unknown to him. The police apprehended the suspect. He confessed and eventually received a 23-year sentence. Even though the perpetrator of this horrible crime had been taken off the street, Donna still had trouble healing from this devastating event. She tried counseling, but felt that the experience never provided much help. Therefore, Donna eventually reached out to the Victims Voices Heard program. She wanted to know why. Why me? What did I do? Donna would go through 6 months of preparation before she would meet Jamil face to face. By meeting her attacker, Donna was able to find out information beyond the cursory information contained in police reports in the trial transcript. These answers could only come from the rapist. For example, Donna wanted to know if she had fought back, and she wanted to know if her attacker had been stalking her. Before meeting with Jamal, Donna also was able to obtain a photograph of him. This was important because she wanted to put a face with her fear. Before the meeting took place, Donna and Jamil exchanged letters. Jamil had also written individual letters of apology to Donna, her husband, and her family. Jamil also was assigned VVH homework prior to the meeting. For example, he wrote about his troubled childhood, and this was shared with Donna prior to the meeting. Also, Jamil provided more insight into the crime. He told Donna at the meeting that rape was not his initial intent. When he first saw Donna, he only wanted to rob her. Also, Jamil admitted that Donna was picked completely at random. This brought her an enormous amount of comfort, for Donna meeting face-to-face with her offender resolved many of her long-standing fears. By facing her deepest fears and internalized self-blame, the VVH process unlocked the keys to Donna's own internal prison. Next, read the story of Allison, who at 19 was raped and almost killed by a 21-year-old male assailant. As you read through this section of the book, pay particular attention to the victim-offender dialogue that took place. Do you believe that this victim-offender dialogue had a healing effect on Allison, the same way it did Donna? Are these types of interactions helpful, and can they facilitate rehabilitation and healing? Try to reflect upon these questions as you continue reading After the Crime.